Hi everyone, Tumthany Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Sufjan Stevens and Lowell Brams album, Aporia. This is a new musical collaboration featuring indie phenom, singing-songwriting legend Mr. Sufjan Stevens, and Lowell Brams. If that name is familiar, that's because Lowell is the Lowell from Sufjan Stevens' 2015 critically acclaimed album, Carrie and Lowell. Brams is obviously not just Sufjan's stepfather, he is a musician himself as well, though that should be no surprise as he co-founded Asthmatic Records with Sufjan and dropped a record on that label in 2009. It featured contributions from Sufjan as well. So in concept, these two crossing over musically is nothing new. However, here on this record, they're doing it in a big way, with a full list of 21 tracks, all of which flirt with ambient music and new age and progressive electronics. Now, I admit, going into this record, I did not have the highest expectations, mostly because some of the teaser material I heard, I didn't think it was all that impressive, but I did get the impression this was going to be a pretty experimental and cerebral listen whose appeal couldn't merely be boiled down to a 2 or 3 minute song. So I just avoided any and all other previews of this thing in hopes that a holistic listen would lead to more enjoyment. But I'm sad to report that this project didn't come together in a holistic fashion whatsoever. The track list on this thing is basically one half-hearted synth and electronic piece after another, very few of which actually develop into anything memorable. And what's worse about this record is just how derivative all of it is. Rarely does a moment go by where I'm not thinking of how another artist could do this but better. Like the eerie drones and fuzzy tones toward the end of Mythology that are pretty apocalyptic and, to me, sound like some somewhat watered-down Tim Hecker, which wouldn't be too bad if it actually had some structure to it or, I don't know, opened up before just cutting off abruptly around 1 minute and 45 seconds. And on Afterworld Alliance, we get a lot of very digital, moody synth layers set to semi-industrial rhythms that are very patient, somewhat relaxing. I'm kind of reminded of Trent Reznor's work. In addition to this, there are multiple tracks on this thing that just sound like bad film music, like on What It Takes, which has these pretty hopeful strings and vocals combined with these tribal beats. It sounds like the preparation montage before a Disney princess goes and fights a battle with a villain with her animal sidekick. Meanwhile, Agathon sounds like what you would get with the Terminator soundtrack with 1/8 of the budget. On Backhanded Cloud, we have these dissonant layers of what sound like strings from a psychological thriller, but then the track bows out really quickly after some very obtuse synth arpeggios start blaring and covering everything else in the mix. It reminds me of something a group like Tangerine Dream would have to do back in the day if like some of the equipment like shit the bed and then they needed something else to just kind of like end a song off. Except in this case, that happened because, I don't know, the piece had nowhere to go next after like a few moments of existence. Look, there are tracks on this thing that while they are on, they do border on beautiful or add up to maybe some faithful Eno worship or a little Vangelis worship too. But more often than not, what I'm being handed in this track list are these very short-winded, unimpressive experiments for Raymond Scott, for example, which is so preposterous. I wonder how Mr. Scott would feel about this track. It almost sounds like a diss. Or I'm hearing what sounds like an audition for the soundtrack to the new Neil Breen film where he impregnates a cyborg alien with his 5 laptops spilling coffee everywhere in the process. With weak compositions, scant progressions, and a total lack of originality, the only thing that could possibly save this album is if the sound design were like over-the-top amazing. But even that most of the time is so-so, even though it's maybe one of the better things the record has going for it. The textures, timbres, and sound play on this LP are standard at best or unintentionally grating at worst. Like on the track The Runaround that features this really pitchy synthesizer wailing all over the mix in a horrid way. The more I listen to it, the more I feel like I'm getting tinnitus. And what's funny is the teaser material from this album that ends up mostly toward the end of it actually ended up being the best tracks on the entire record when compared to the rest of the album. So there's still some of the most artistically coherent pieces here, despite still not being much to write home about. I will say I did kind of love the quirky, semi-industrial underwater synth odyssey presented on the track Captain Praxis. That to me reminded me of what would happen if you had Trent Reznor soundtracking The Life Aquatic. And I did like the booming and vast synth piece EUDAIMONIA, which reminded me of what you may get if you took a bunch of instrumental bits from a new wave song and tried to force that into an ambient track. The closer on this thing was pretty thankless as well, in my opinion. I'm just not really enjoying this at all. This is about as disheveled, unfocused, and pointless as an album in this style can be. There are some fleeting moments of intrigue and beauty here and there in the track list, but don't expect any of it to last for very long. I'm feeling a light to decent 3 on this thing. Transition. Have you given this record a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best. You're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another review that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Sufjan Stevens, Lowell Brams, forever.